Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. If you could please make your way to your seats and try to wrap up your conversations. Our next presentation is on track surfaces, and I think we'll all agree that Keeneland is a beautiful example of how experimentation and, most importantly, technology have created one of the best racing surfaces in the country. Dr. Mick Peterson is going to be the moderator of this panel. He's the executive director of Racing Surfaces Technology Laboratory. This is a testing laboratory that was funded by the Jockey Club, in part with some other organizations. But just to give you a little bit of a background on Dr. Michael, better known as Mick Peterson. He's a mechanical engineering professor at the University of Maine in the United States. Dr. Peterson's research links traditional understanding of engineering mechanics and materials to the biomechanics of animals. His research emphasis is on the manner in which dynamic response can be used to characterize materials. His greatest passion is for understanding of racing surfaces and equestrian surfaces, and that's lucky for all of us. Originating in work 20 years ago on a new medical imaging technique, this work has gradually grown from an interest in the effective exercise on bone remodeling to a focus on applying concepts from manufacturing quality control to improved racing surface consistency for the protection of horses and riders. Dr. Peterson collaborated with Dr. Wayne McElraith at Colorado State University to found the Racing Surfaces Testing Laboratory. The laboratory is a nonprofit organization supported by the racing industry, which is providing research, testing, and materials characterization services for the horse racing industry. If you guys could please join me in welcoming Dr. Mick Peterson.
Hello, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to have a panel that I bring up in a few minutes here, but I'm going to start out by giving a little bit of background and motivating some of our discussion that we're going to have. When we talk about the job of a track superintendent, I tend to define it quite differently than it has been historically. Historically, it was thought of more as just a maintenance job, and it'd be barn maintenance, track maintenance, front side maintenance. I look at it as the responsibility of the track superintendent is to reduce musculoskeletal disease in the horse. That's a very different job than backside maintenance, front side maintenance, and track maintenance. But the question then becomes, how do we do this? This is becoming a complicated technical position, and it requires information. We have to start by understanding injuries. So you can see the sequence of talks today. We start out with the rider, we go to the horse, and now we're talking about the track. This discussion started intensely in 2006 on the Summit of the Health of the Horse. And if you'll recall, to sort of set the stage, we had Barbaro in the 2006 Preakness, 8 bells in the Kentucky Derby in 2008. This was not a particularly auspicious time in the industry. But at the time, there was some discussion, and I was quoted by T.D. Thornton, who's now at the Thoroughbred Daily News, as saying that racing can take control of safety by embracing a culture of data. Think about these first two talks we've listened to today, talking about the rider injuries, the equipment, changes in helmets, specifications, or using specified helmets, and the idea of using injury data in order to understand what can be modified. So this most important outcome of this culture of data is the equine injury database. This is a rare success in this industry where we decided in 2006 that we had to do something. 2008 it was implemented, and now we're looking at 6 years of data and beginning to be able to make decisions. A number of other outcomes included the Racing Surfaces Testing Laboratory, these equipment changes we're discussing, and also the NTRA accreditation came out of the same era. So now, where do we go from here? What Tim was talking about before this was risk reduction, beginning to use models to look at which horses need attention, consideration, management. The idea here is to reduce the risk of a bad year at a track or a horse taking a bad step. The risk reduction are these factors. If we start looking at these are the factors that we step through. If we look at these, number of starts, intact male, 3-year-old and up, not raced as a 2-year-old, multiple starts 1 to 6 months, and the bottom level claiming. These are the factors we look at for a horse to begin to assess risk. But now, what does this mean for surfaces? We still need the culture of data for surfaces. The Equine Injury Database looks at horses, riders, jurisdiction, training info. You saw surface type. But there's very limited track information in that data set. So what I'm going to talk about today, and what motivates the discussion from the panel, is the maintenance quality system that's in place at 9 racetracks currently. This data track starts out with the design data of the track, has a periodic track inspection associated with this, and includes then all the maintenance information associated with that track. The idea here is this is the start of another initiative for the industry that begins to expand this culture of data. What do we mean by design documentation? Well, what equipment's used? There's not standard equipment in the racing industry. The equipment has been adapted to local climate, condition, materials, needs, culture. Tests start out with target compositions. This is the silt, clay, wax content, all these decisions that are made and discussed in the industry. The geometry, the banking, the length of the straights, radius of the turn, and then of course having some way of documenting the weather at the track. This is a lot of data. There's a lot of variables. Track surfaces are complicated. It's one of the reasons they're controversial. If you look at this, there's the equipment planning, and we start out with this big matrix of data. It's different for a synthetic. It's different for dirt. The composition tests are different for turf or synthetic. And the design of the surfaces even vary, since most of our turf tracks, for example, are inside of the dirt tracks in the United States. Then there's a series of tests that need to be done every race meet, or for those tracks that have really long race meets when there's a change of season, especially with a dirt or a turf track. When you get to a rainy period or a dry period, it's a completely different track. Using ground penetrating radar to inspect the base, the biomechanical surface testing to measure the surface, and testing the composition. This is signing off. This is the pre-takeoff checklist. This is sitting there on the tarmac waiting for the plane to take off and know you're ready for the race meet. Again, it's a matrix that depends on the material and has a number of different measurements that have to be done. Finally, every day you have to adapt to the weather. That's the real challenges that the superintendents are facing in their reduction of musculoskeletal disease risk. They're looking at being able to adapt their equipment. They log their equipment, measuring the cushion depth of the track. At a number of the tracks, they're using GPS to track to make sure that the equipment went out on the track when it was supposed to. And then also moisture measurements or going stick measurements or other daily measurements of the other conditions on the track. Most importantly, moisture. Again, we end up with a large matrix of data that we're taking every day at every track. So we've already been doing this now for 4 years at a number of the major tracks where we have a very extensive data. And the question is, what's the take-home message? What do we learn so far? Well, this is another one of those cases like listening to the talk last night where in some cases we point out the obvious, and in this case, there's one thing that we have verified does in fact matter immensely. If you've got a turf or a dirt track particularly, water, water, and water is what matters on that track. Maintaining a wet racetrack, drainage on a turf track, irrigating a turf track, or using water trucks and maintaining and controlling the water trucks. This is an overwhelming issue in the maintenance. When we measure moisture day to day, we see variation around the track, we see variation between the days, there's rainy days, there's dry periods. Those are the challenges that the superintendents face. Going back again, to what Tim discussed, if we look at synthetic tracks versus dirt tracks, the injury rates on synthetic tracks are fairly consistently low. Synthetic tracks are not sensitive to moisture. That's the primary difference. They're less sensitive to moisture. And we have a consistent story. If you look at dirt tracks, though, if you look at individual tracks, you'll see rather dramatic variations in the injury rates from one year to the next. Well, the same people are maintaining it. They're using the same methods. So it's almost certainly a result of variation in weather. Now, at this point, I can't tell you whether this effects are statistically significant because this would take a huge amount of data in order to represent this. But it's very clear anecdotally that there are good years and bad years. And what we do see is those good years and bad years are fewer and farther between if you've got a synthetic track. So our goal here is looking at water to make every year a good year. So I'd like to introduce our panel. Glen Kozak is the Vice President of Surfaces and Facilities at the New York Racing Association. He was previously at the Maryland Jockey Club and has done a lot of other things in his life. Our second panelist is Jim Pendergest. He's General Manager of the Thoroughbred Center. He previously worked with Polytrack for the synthetic tracks. He was also heavily involved in the installation of the new dirt track at Keeneland. And finally, Jamie Richardson, who is the new track superintendent at Churchill Downs. He was at Oakland and Maryland Jockey Club prior to this job. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to start this out by asking Glen, putting him on the spot first. Glen, there was a big event this year at one of the racetracks you took care of, Belmont. I don't know what the event was. Maybe you can remind us. But what's fundamentally different on the 2 or 3 days before a Triple Crown bid? What do you do to make sure the track's ready or that you don't get noticed?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you for having myself at this panel as well as this group. You know, on that day, obviously that was a tremendous day for the industry in whole, but for us, we try and approach that day as any other day with the racetrack being prepped correctly and, as you pointed out, not being noticed, where, you know, we've said in previous discussions, we're always talked about souping up a racetrack or how the racetrack changes for a big day. We want to fly under the radar and have a consistent day in and day out. And one of the things that certainly has helped us do that is with this maintenance database, because being able to track what we do on all of our tracks has made, you know, I think we've made very, very good strides. There's still certain things that we're working with you and other individuals on to improve our surfaces, but to have that information, and as you say, water, now being able to document both in the morning and after the races, how the racetrack has responded to whether it's weather, whether it's the storm, whether it's temperature. Those are things that, you know, have really evolved for us. But that day, I mean, leading up to it, we had rain in the morning. I know Baffert, he was tickled pink when we got 1/4 inch and was hoping for more. And then we just maintained the track as we normally would for any other day.
Jamie, you're going to be coming into the Derby next year as the superintendent for the first time. How do you plan for the track and how do you manage the weather? I'm particularly thinking about in the Derby. If we think about the last few years, there's the timing of sealing the track and an open track, and I guess does the timing of that sealing of the track depend on track materials, given the fact that you've worked at a number of different tracks?
Yeah, I know you and I have talked about it, Mick, a couple of years ago. It poured rain Derby Day, 2012. People here in Lexington were cutting their grass and rained all day in Louisville. You know, Churchill's, you know, I've worked at Pimlico, Laurel, you know, Oakland and Churchill. And, you know, Churchill's very forgiving. You know, if it doesn't have the right amount of moisture in it, it doesn't want to float right. And I know David Lear was there at that time, and I think Mick thought he might have, you know, missed it, but he hit it right on. And, you know, it looked like he, you know, probably should have floated a race or two ahead of when he did. But, once the floats went over, it actually, it looked great. The track was great the rest of the day. Orb went on to win the Derby. Back east, other tracks I worked at, I would have maybe wanted to get out there a little sooner, and I think maybe it might have been better. But every track, they all have their own idiosyncrasies. They're all a little different. So they all. That's one of the things we do is you learn them, and you do the best with the knowledge you have there. And next year for the Derby, I just plan to, just like Glenn, try to stay out of the limelight. Just consistency and that's another thing, consistency, and these measurements help us, do that. You try to keep consistent, the track consistent from day to day and maintain like that.
So to keep going on that note, you've been responsible for the turf track and taken over the turf track the last couple of years. I know you've done quite a bit with the turf track. What have been the changes, and what have you had to do, particularly, again, thinking about, we've discussed some of the water issues on the turf track as well.
Well, yeah, turf track, the irrigation systems are definitely, there's a good irrigation system on a turf course and watering evenly. It's hard to do. Actually, I wanted to talk to Glenn about that with hedges. I've never actually had any experience with a hedge. So Churchill has a hedge, and it poses certain problems to just get the water on evenly with the irrigation heads hitting the hedge and things like that. And we've cut the turf down at Churchill. It's a little shorter than it used to be, and thatched it and aerated it, and it's actually been a very good course the last couple of years, I believe, and it's draining well and done real well the last couple of years, held up well, and everyone's been pretty happy with it.
Glenn, you've been doing a lot of work on the irrigation side as well, on the turf side. What all has that entailed?
Sure. Well, fortunately, at Saratoga, we're installing a new automated system there that's going to help. As some of you have known, Saratoga is just done with a manual pipe system. So as far as consistencies and getting even patterns down there, it's challenging to say the least. So having the ability to water the courses both in the morning or even in the evenings in a set amount of time is going to be a very, very big improvement for us. Some points right now, it takes us 5.5 hours to water both turf courses up at Saratoga. And with running 6 days a week up there, wrapping up racing on a Saturday night and trying to get a little bit of water on it for good racing conditions on Sunday, it's a big strain on the crew for sure, even though it only is a 40-day meet. So I mean, we're spending close to a lot of money, 7 figures up there to get this system done correctly. We brought in a consultant that's been fantastic. He's had industry experience, and it shows. Since it is such a big project up at Saratoga, this will be the second year that we've been working on it, and we wrapped up this fall. We now brought this same consultant down to Belmont, and at Belmont, what that's helped us with, with the 2 big turf courses down there, we were in the same challenge where trying to water, a 1 5/16 and a 1 3/16 after Friday or Saturday night races without the pumps, without the right heads on there. It was a lot of work we haven't updated our equipment. So technology has evolved, equipment has evolved, pumps have evolved. When I got in there, it took a couple years to get my arms around some of the issues, but the issues were we had the same pattern, the same heads all the way around the track, whether it was a straightaway, whether it was a turn. And it certainly can't be. As Jamie pointed out, we've got hedges in certain locations, gaps in others, door lock race rail in other areas. So having somebody that has that experience to pinpoint and also have the ability to dial back heads and water a certain point, if one area of the course dries out quicker than another area, we noticed that by using some of the instruments that you had recommended and brought out. This Tdr Probe has been fantastic, where we can identify certain areas, whether it's on the clubhouse turn or in front of one of the chutes, where we've got the ability now to water 25 minutes in one area and 3 minutes in another area that we never had before. So, you know, and that will continue to evolve. It's something that it's just like the dirt courses. We can always do more, and we will always strive to, but you know, again, it's starting at simple steps and working, and it's been effective already, where we can now water the 2 Belmont turf courses and put down 1/4 of an inch now in an hour and 45 minutes, what used to take 5 hours. So, and that's just having a computerized system that recognizes the efficiencies of what heads to run. It doesn't take the maintenance out of it per se, where it's still managed and there's somebody there checking off that each head goes on, each head goes off, but it's something that now a computer is going through the efficiencies rather than somebody sitting with a touch tone or a cell phone turning on the heads.
Speaking of new stuff, Jim, you have also been involved in a rather new project, and I mean, not just you, the whole crew around here. What all can you say about like the moisture sorts of issues and that on the installation?
Well, I think that after the composition of the surface, the moisture was the next most important part for us as far as getting the surface set up the way we wanted it. Our construction company, when they were installing the limestone base, used a nuclear densometer, and they were able to use that to determine the exact compaction, the exact moisture level they needed for ideal compaction of the limestone. So then they were able to do that for us with the surface. So once the surface was down and they were ready to hand it over to us, we were able to correlate with the nuclear densometer. 8.5% was the moisture level that they had. We correlated that with the TDR, which was 12.5%. So we were able throughout the whole process to make sure we had the track as close to 12.5% as possible. And we would have spots, like Glenn was saying, where we'd find we needed to put an extra load of water on when we were doing the compaction to keep it up. You know, if you had wind blowing down the straightaway, it might dry out faster. So with the TDR, we would check the moisture 4 or 5 times a day, and we would do it at every 8th pole, and we'd go 5 spots throughout the track to make sure that we were keeping the moisture right where we needed it for compaction. And then once we got ready for training, once we were able to turn the track over, we found that we wanted somewhere between 18 and 20% moisture in the track for training, which surprised me a little bit. But with the horses, you're not looking for maximum compaction. You're looking for maximum support for the horses. And that's the level we needed with this track. Now with the Thoroughbred Center, we needed a different level. With that track, we shoot for 25 to 29% moisture with the TDR. And I think, you know, the big key to that is it's a more sandy track. We don't have to stay open in the wintertime. I mean, we keep it open in the wintertime, so we have to have it more sandy and a little less silt. With the track here at Keeneland, we had the luxury of not keeping it open during the winter, so it has a little more silt in it. So consequently, the moisture content doesn't have to be quite as high.
Well, that was a nice segue into the challenges then. Once it gets to be fall, end of fall, you begin to get into the rain transitions into ice. What's the strategy at the Thoroughbred Center for controlling moisture that then turns into ice?
Well, we changed the track a little bit in the fall compared to the summer. In the summer, we'll add more silt to it. And in the fall, when we're replacing sand, we'll add pure sand so that we loosen it up for the wintertime. That way we don't get as many clods. It's a little easier to take care of. You know, our plan is to seal it every night for whatever kind of moisture we're going to get, if it's snow or ice or rain. If we get ice, we have to work the ice into it. One of the things we found a few years ago is you cannot let ice accumulate on it. You have to work that in and get it melted. We add some salt to it. We don't add a lot, but we'll periodically add salt to the surface. And then it really, there's a variety of things that we have to do depending on what the weather is. You know, our worst case, we went 3 years without missing a day of training. And then the last 2 years, most people know we've had terrible winters here, and we've lost 5 days in the last 2 years. Most of that was because of snow, and that's really the toughest thing for us because we don't get enough snow here to warrant having snow removal equipment. So this past year we had 12 inches on one occasion, 19 on another, and there's not a lot we can do with that at that point. We've got to melt some of it and then we grade the rest of it off. But it's tough for us to be training the next day after that. So that's worst case. Second worst case is when you have temperatures falling at 4 o'clock in the morning. You're going to open at 6 o'clock and you really don't have time to get it freeze dried. And then rain in the afternoon and temperatures falling is a big challenge for us, but I've got a great crew. They do a good job, and at that point, it becomes more artwork than science. What they do with the track as it starts to freeze, they'll get on it with some different pieces of equipment. They'll use a conditioner on it, use a diamond tooth on it. They'll break up the clods. Those clods then start to create moisture, and we draw moisture up in the track again. So they have to get off of it before it gets too wet. Let it start to freeze again. Then they get back on it, and they go through that process throughout the night until it's freeze-dried.
So what is the track like for the horses when it's freeze-dried?
If it's totally freeze-dried, it's great. It's ground up like coffee grounds. So you don't have, when it's perfect like that, you don't have any clods in it when you have that perfect condition. Sometimes it can be a little cloddy if you don't get everything just right.
So Glenn, I think about you when I think about winter surfaces, since you and you and Jamie both have spent time in both Maryland and New York. I guess starting out, what are the differences between your winter track and your summer track? And then also maybe what are some of the differences between the Maryland winter racing and New York winter racing?
Sure. The differences between our summer track and, or actually let's say either at Belmont or Aqueduct, would be the limestone base on the winter track or our training track at Belmont, and then clay base on both main tracks. As far as the weather pattern compared to what was down in Maryland is pretty consistent, and I'd have to say that Aqueduct is pretty close to what conditions are down at Laurel, just because Aqueduct being so close to the water and by the bay. And at Laurel, the area where it's located, there was some wetlands area, so it would always retain a lot of moisture, which would affect different parts of the track down there differently. As far as the temperatures, Maryland was a couple degrees warmer, which could either help or hurt you in certain instances. And there's quite a bit of variation even between Belmont and Aqueduct, just with the proximity to the water, where there'll be times where at Aqueduct we'll get 3 or 4 inches of snow and be able to get it off the track very quickly, and then at Belmont, 8 miles away, we'll get 8 or 10 inches of snow. So the weather patterns certainly dictate everything that we do with the tracks. And going back to the differences, as far as the cushion content, we're trying to keep the cushion consistent between all of our racing surfaces, meaning the clay and the silt and the sand content. So I would say our testing is probably one of the biggest things that we've really, really pushed for. Is we're testing so much more than we ever have in the past, just with the amount of these big rainfalls that we get. We got 1 1/8 inches last night at Saratoga. What washes out of the track now, where we used to test a couple times a year, you're getting samples once a month now. So trying to keep up with the consistency of the cushion is what we've put our focus on the dirt tracks.
So to reiterate there, what's interesting here is the difference between what Jim has to do, because he's only got a single surface, where he has to change the composition to do winter versus the summer, with a little more a sandier track and going into the winter in order to recover from the rain and handle it, but using the 2 different bases at New York. So what about the difference between Laurel and Pimlico on the composition and or the base?
On that, Jamie can answer, where he took care of Pimlico for so long. They're both limestone bases, and when we rebuilt Laurel, there was we used most of the old cushion, as well as amended it with a cushion product that a bunch of the racetracks in that northeast region use from better materials. And it took a little bit to get that tweaked to, again, what we wanted to use, with adding a type of masonry sand to it and a type of clay locally from that region near Bowie. But there were differences between the tracks, where it seemed like with a smaller track at Pimlico, meaning the width of the track, it would certainly dry out quicker than what we'd get at Laurel, just because of the width of the track and where the crown was located. The one turn at Laurel was always a fight because of the wind coming off of the parking lot with snow blowing across the turf courses, but You know, the guys, I was fortunate when I was down there, the guys did a great job on the tracks, and Maryland's always had a great name for their surfaces.
Jamie, I mean, you've dealt with winter weather in Oakland as well, and the transitions out of the rainy periods to the cold periods at Oakland. Do you have anything to add? How did you handle that? You had just one surface, of course. So.
Oakland, actually, I will be the first one to admit I had a great winter the year I was at Oakland. They've had some challenges down there. The winter I was there, we actually only missed one morning of training. I mean, we had some mornings it was down into the teens, but all in all, it was a decent winter. That track, you know, it was a learning experience for me because I was used to having the limestone base. Oakland has a clay base with, you know, 6 inches of cushion. So it was a bit challenging, you know, not getting it too deep at night, working it. You know, we would work it all night, and you know, you didn't want it to get too deep, so we had to keep the bottom in it, and you know, yet keep the top loose enough for racing and training. Again, thank God it wasn't a horrible winter. Didn't have any of the big ice storms that they are known to get. So, you know, we had a good winter that winter.
So I'd like to open it up then for the three of you to take turns, and if you could right now, with your in your imagination, think of what the industry could be focusing on to keep tracks consistent and really support the track maintenance. As you know, I'm a big advocate of more data, but you can take data indefinitely. At some point, you have to actually make decisions and take care of a racetrack. What do you see as your biggest barrier to consistency on a day-to-day basis? We'll let you start out, Jamie, since you're on this end.
You know, again, consistency is the key. You know, I was telling somebody earlier, not that you would want, you know, you want that optimum track, and trainers will have differences of opinions there. I mean, some guys want it a little harder, some guys want it a little deeper. You know, some people want their horse to work in 36, 37, you know, others, you know, don't want to go faster than 39. So, you know, you never make everybody totally happy. I think you find you know, I know a challenge in the morning at Churchill is opening the track up at 6 a.m. for training and having it not too hard the first set that goes out there, and yet not having it, you know, knee deep by the break. You know, that's a bit challenging. You have to find, you know, there's a fine line you have to, you know, kind of skirt there so that it's not, you know, hard again at 6 o'clock and yet maintains a decent surface right on through the harrow break to the harrow break. I'm sure, you know, Glen sees that, and Jim, you know, with the quantity of horses they have training, you know, Glen's got a bunch of tracks, but a bunch of horses. So, you know, that's always a challenge, but, you know, just consistency to me is the key. And, you know, the information we gain through data you know, helps us keep that consistency.
Jim?
Well, I think there are two things that could really help the track superintendents. One is improved moisture measurement, being able to apply the water with the water trucks and get it consistent all the way around the track, and being able to control that. The TDR helps a lot with that. Just better water trucks as we go forward will be a big help. And the other thing is the surface, the consistency of the composition of the surface, and testing that routinely is really what can help, where they know they have the same surface that they started with last year.
Glenn?
I'd reiterate what Jim and Jamie had mentioned as far as grading and keeping the track consistent. As Jamie pointed out, every trainer's looking for something different, but at least if the track stays stable and consistent, they can work their patterns or their training accordingly. It's when there's those fluctuations, whether the track was back raked or whether the track was harrowed, try and stay consistent with that. As Jim pointed out, for the expense of what a Tdr probe is, for whatever size track is out there, even if it isn't being logged, just the information that gives to the superintendent to be able to see what the variations are on the track. Because when a track is harrowed and watered and, you know, it looks a little dry on top from the wind going over it, when you go around with the probe to be able to find points that might be near a specific drain that you didn't realize was pulling so much material towards, or that there is a change in composition that you might not see by eye, or you didn't test that specific area, you're going to pick that up with a probe. So certainly for the expense of what the probe is, I can't recommend that enough to tracks, to go out and spend that little bit of money to be able to give another tool to the guys taking care of the tracks.
Well, and neither of our Californians are here, but I should note that while this group is talking about the difficulty of maintaining in the winter, what the Californians would say at this point is the difficulty of maintaining a dirt track when you've got the Santa Ana winds coming in across the Santa Anita track is similarly challenging, because you suddenly get periods of rapid evaporation of moisture, and it's really difficult to keep up with it, especially if it's just evaporating off the top. So we're going to end up finishing up here a little early, but I do have one other thing. Oh, I should explain. Yes, actually, let me take just a moment and go back, and I can actually show you. This is one of the tools that was being used in this slide back here. If you look, this is the probe that's being used up here in the top right, and that's actually the picture from Santa Anita racetrack. And what it is it's just it's the TDR stands for time domain reflectometry, and USDA did a significant amount of work to determine what was the best measurement technology for measuring moisture content in fields. And this is the device that's being used for moisture measurement. And there's been a number of other tools that have been used. Penetrometers and the going stick have been used for measuring consistency of turf or turf tracks typically. And it turns out that most of these other measurements are correlated very strongly to the moisture content. So basically it's the answer we got out of this, which is water, water, water. And so by measuring cushion depth, which is done on a daily basis during racing in New York, which gives you the amount of material over the limestone base, and measuring the moisture, you're getting the two primary inputs into this, and then if you know what equipment's gone out there and when they went out there, and then over the course of the day you measure the moisture in the track. So if we go back to what we've been doing then with this, if you think about this, we've got all this design and other information that's coming out of the maintenance quality system, and we've got the equine injury database where we're now up to 6 years of data. The challenge now is to figure out what kind of design information, and some of this is going to include things like banking and turn radius, moisture, the type of maintenance equipment, and then we've got the equine injury database where we know which horses and what risk factors. At this point, our goal is to begin to tie these two large sets of data together to begin to see what matters. Now, in a lot of cases, the things that matter may not persist if you keep measuring them. And I think moisture is the best case of that. Because if every day you're going out and taking moisture measurements around the track, what we see is a trend that regularly occurs, that the moisture becomes more and more consistent. Because when you're measuring it, you notice it, and when you notice it, it becomes more consistent. Same with the maintenance, logging the maintenance equipment use. If you log it every day, when you're writing it down, you have to write down the measurements, the settings on the harrows, and the speed, and that gives you one more step to go through that checklist. Again, thinking in terms of aircraft maintenance, it's like what we're doing is we're building a highly reliable system every day for the safety of the horse and the rider. And this gets back to those key words as a culture of data. We started out with the jockey today, we go to the horse, we talk to the surfaces. When we begin to tie these three pieces together, that's when we begin to affect safety for the horse and rider. Thank you. Perfect. Kathy will be coming around with the microphone. If you'll raise your hand, we can open this up for a few questions.
Dan Fick with Prairie Meadows. How about over the years I've worked with Mick on racing surfaces, and there's been a number of times there's been some anecdotal information about there was an increase in soft tissue injuries in the morning, went back and looked at the track maintenance records and found out we were doing something a little different, changed that. So from these guys, how about some anecdotal information where your maintenance records and the EID have led you to make a change and it's helped?
So I guess to clarify, who wants to take that?
Sure, I'll take that. We're keeping extensive records with that, and one of the things that has started that we've worked with a group at NYRA as well as with the New York State Gaming Commission with Dr. Palmer is reviewing all of that information. So not only are we reviewing the trainer, the jockey, the horse, the location on the track, what the weather conditions are, what type of equipment was used, what the temperature was, what the wind speed was. So all of that information is being analyzed. At this point, it's premature to say something that we're able to clarify whether there is a soft tissue injury or a bone injury. But what we're trying to do is to go through and put all of these components together. And I'm sure this is something that I hate to throw it on Dr. Palmer, but that we're able to look at this information and see if there are any correlations to those types of things with what we're doing, either with the training methods in the morning, meaning how the track is open, reaching out to the veterinarians in the barn area, as well as our chief examining vet, if there is anything that they're noticing with a specific injury, or if there's a higher occurrence of something taking place at any one of our tracks. The communication between not only the private practitioner, but also with our state vet, as well as our chief examining vet, are things that we're working at NYRA.
Well, and to elaborate a minute too, the places where I've seen that happen as well, oftentimes it's ended up being there was nothing different. So if you think about that long list of risk factors, with track surfaces is only one of them, that helps make the decision moving forward, because the biggest risk at this point is that we make a sudden alteration in the track surface based on a single rare event, and once that rare event has happened, we then threaten the rest of the horse population by altering the system. So really it's building confidence in the track and building confidence knowing that there will be the information there when the questions come up over time.
This is Ned Bonney. I'm a member of the Kentucky Racing Commission. What work have you done or anticipate doing on elevations on the turns of racetracks? Clearly, from the exhibit that you've published, the elevations are important. So can you give us an update on, if you measure in the course of your employment by racetracks, and if so, what your recommendations are with respect to elevations? Obviously, it depends on the circumference of the turns, but is that a factor in horse injuries? And if so, what do you and your experts believe should be done with respect to that?
Well, I'm going to start out, and I will put the panel on the button here and ask them. So, can you describe your banking and your track? I guess I'll let Jamie start out with Oakland and Churchill. How would you describe the banking?
The banking, you're dealing with a lot of tracks that are older. Oakland, Churchill, Pimlico, they haven't been rebuilt in, a number of years. And I think we're learning that, banking's, it's a double-edged sword. It's tougher for maintenance. Some people, I think Michael Dickenson would tell you there's never too much banking, but I think probably there can be, and obviously from a maintenance standpoint, there definitely can be maintenance issues with banking, washouts and heavy rains and things like that. Banking also probably, depends a lot, on your circumference. Belmont doesn't need as much banking as a mile track. The radiuses are going to be much wider, bigger. So I think, that's, we still need to do a lot of, research there, and that's more in Mick. I mean, I think the standard is, 3.5 to 4%, on a standard mile track. But that, technology, and research, could that be upped a little bit? I think so, and without making it a maintenance nightmare.
Jim?
At the Thoroughbred Center, we've got 2.5% slope on the straightaways, and that transitions into a 4% on the turns. And that was designed by Joe King when that track was built. And there are some issues with maintenance with trying to increase the banking on the turn and trying to keep the sand in place. And I know of one study with higher banking for standardbreds, but I'm not aware of any studies with thoroughbreds where banking has really been resolved with that. So, I think that's one area that we probably need to do some more research.
With our three racetracks, it's anywhere from 2% to 2 3/4% on the straightaways, and 3% up to 3 3/4% on the turns. And as far as the studies, we certainly have not done any studies with the banking on it. The one issue that we come up with, just as Jamie and Jim pointed out, is the wintertime with the constant harrowing and the maintenance with putting a 4, 5, or 6% bank, as certain individuals have suggested. How much material migrates to that inside rail that you're able to maintain, that you're able to grade out and keep that racetrack consistent, where in the morning you don't have 8 inches of cushion right at the rail, and then out at the crown of the track only have 2 or 3 inches of cushion. So at this point, there's no plans for any changes. What we have with our banking, and it's pretty much industry standards.
And so I think that does kind of summarize where it's at. There's a lot of practical implications on the amount of crossfall in the, which is just the crossfall in the straights, which is primarily to get the water off during when you have a sealed track. The banking in the turns on a dirt track is somewhat limited because of the maintenance issues that Glenn and alluded to. Because what happens is, as you harrow, the material will all move to the inside. You end up with a lot of material along the inside rail. A group that I've been working with, we've just completed some work with the laterality of injuries from the equine injury database, and that would be the right versus left leg injuries on the leading forelimb and trailing hind limb. Turns out that there's surface effects on that as well as turn radius effects. The other major challenge with banking is there's no standard within the industry of how the transitions are done. And I think most people who know a lot more about the biomechanics and the riding of a horse around a turn than I do will tell you that the change of lead and the bobble that the horse has when they transition into the turn can be quite dramatic, as well as changing lead going into the straight. So those transitions are probably key to the whole discussion of the biomechanics of the horse, and those are not standard. In some tracks, they start about 100 yards before the track and transition about 100 yards out of the turn. In other tracks, the transition into the banking occurs at the start of the turn. So it's actually an incredibly complicated problem. But to specifically answer your question, for those 9 tracks that are participating, the next initiative is we will do surveying of the track every time before every race meet as a part of the signing off at the beginning of the race meet. We will know the exact measurements of the turn as we start into it. This is, again, building on knowing the information, knowing where we start, and then we can begin to see what are the risk factors.
I have a question, Dr. Peterson. Has there been any discussion between the tracks, the different superintendents, and the studies that they're doing with equine injury prevention about changing the direction for training hours so that the horses will train counterclockwise one day and clockwise the other day to maybe change up the risk of injury to certain limbs because of the banking?
Do you want to address the logistics? I guess a training center is where I immediately think about the changing directions. What are your thoughts on that, Jim?
I really hadn't considered that before. That's the first time I've heard that mentioned, so I haven't given it any thought at this point.
Either
Sure. 3 years ago, we had a couple trainers that asked about, we set aside special training hours to be able to go in the, as we say, the wrong direction. and it was very limited. It wasn't used. There didn't. I think Kenny McPeak was the first that asked on us after one of the welfare and safety meetings, and we presented it to the trainers. And I think there were 5 or 6 trainers that used it a couple days, and then it never really caught any traction. But it's certainly something that we have the luxury at Belmont to be able to do on the training track, but there hasn't been a real demand for it. But if it's something that the trainers have an issue, would like to, it's something that we could consider for sure.
We started out today with a discussion of continuing education, and this is one of those things where I think any discussion of this will have to kind of bubble up out of the from a broader community and out of continuing education. I will tell you that the data is pretty clear, especially on dirt tracks, which tend to dominate the data, that it is the left leading forelimb that where the fractures are. But interestingly enough, that effect is pretty much gone on turf and synthetics. So that suggests that there's a lot more to this. It has a lot to do with the lean of the horse, which is why the standardbred studies that are often cited in the industry are probably not relevant because the gait's so different. And so it's very gait dependent as well as surface dependent. So I hope we will be able to follow up with better information in a year or so at least on the laterality.
Mick, you mentioned continuing education. Can you talk a little bit and the panelists about the importance of your annual track maintenance workshop that you've been doing for the past number of years?
The NTRA started a number of years, and Roy Smith is the one who started that, who is here in the audience. And NTRA started the Racetrack Superintendents Conference. It's an annual meeting, and all 3 of the people here on the panel have attended that. And I guess I did comments on interacting with other superintendents, including the phone calls to other people when you have problems, I guess. I'll let you start, Jamie, because I know you're a master.
Well, I know Roy's intent in starting that. I guess they used to have the symposium there in Arizona, and I know Roy started a program, and it's been very well received and great program to just get superintendents talking. If you have an issue, and maybe you're scratching your head, you could pick up the phone and call somebody else, and maybe they've seen that, and oh yeah, I started doing this, and it seems to really help that situation. So, I think that was basically the main intent, and then it gets us together and gets everybody talking and comparing notes, and you hope for a better, safer racetrack, throughout the country at different places, in turn.
When we were getting the Keeneland track set up, there was one weekend that Javier Barajas was able to come in and help us. And Mike Young stopped by, and we put him on a piece of equipment. And I had Harold Reed, who is the track superintendent from the Thoroughbred Center, over here giving us a hand that day. So I wanted a picture of that. I didn't get it, but we had 3 track superintendents working on getting this thing set up and ready. And that's the kind of participation I'd like to see within the industry.
To that point, I think, these horses ship from track to track, so as safe and as consistent that we can make any of these racetracks, we're all in this together for the thoroughbred industry. As Jamie said, just the communication between the superintendents, any useful knowledge, the equipment, the vendors that Roy has been able to bring in at this superintendent's meeting, I think it's fantastic, and Roy should get a big applause for that, because before that, there wasn't the communication between these tracks, and it's only benefiting not only the superintendents, but everybody involved in the industry.
And there's an informal process that goes on that's very effective as well, and that is the shipping the people back and forth. I know Robbie Minton from Maryland has come to Churchill, and they've compared notes, and then you get comments about what you see on the TV one day, and I know when the new superintendent took over at Arlington on the synthetic track, he immediately went up to Woodbine to learn how to operate equipment to get another set of some more input. So the idea of horses shipping back and forth needs to be complemented with the idea of superintendents shipping back and forth and learning, because it's complicated, and you see the different material, especially when somebody's new to a track. I don't know where Kathy went. Oh, thanks.
Hi. Could the panel discussed the differences between maintaining a limestone versus a clay base, especially in regard to seasonal changes.
Who would like to take that? Glenn?
Sure. Again, the limestone base uses much more water. As I mentioned, Belmont and Aqueduct both have one of each. So the training track at Belmont and the winter track at Aqueduct use a tremendous amount of water, where we have to be a little bit more cautious with the clay base. Even up at Saratoga, an example this morning, as I mentioned earlier, significant rainfall last night, and the Oklahoma track that just has a natural base, just a sand base to it, basically. We were able to harrow that this morning, where the main track was just backraked, where it retains the moisture much more just because of the clay composition in it. The limestone allows for the winter racing, and the training track year-round at Belmont stays open, so we adjust the composition of the cushion similar to what Jim does. We use a clay and a finer sand that we use in the summertime to be able to help maintain or hold the moisture better, and that seemed to work out very well. But it's, again, constant testing that we do with the cushion just to keep it the way we want it.
We talk about a culture of data, and if we looked at the culture of data, we would have synthetic tracks all around the country. However, it looks like synthetic is dead. What is the future of synthetic? Does it have a future? And where do we go from here relative to synthetic surfaces?
One comment on synthetics are dead is Woodbine is replacing their synthetic track with a synthetic track. So I think that there is a recognition that there's certainly a role for that, as well as Turfway, which has been quite successful. I don't know if anyone on the panel would like to comment on their thoughts about the synthetic tracks and their potential applications. I think all of you have at least some affiliation. So, Jim?
Well, I think there are a place for them. I think it's perfect at Turfway Park with the weather they get and the horse population that they have. It's done so much for them over the years with respect to injuries on that track. And I also think there's a huge place for synthetic tracks as training tracks. What's going on here at Keeneland, I think, is the ideal situation where we have a training track that's going to remain poly track and a dirt track that is what the main track consists of. So I think there are places for it, and I completely understand Woodbine's decision with their weather and the conditions that they run in their horse population, that they're maintaining another synthetic surface there.
And I would say in New York, I mean, we're exploring all options at this point. We've certainly done our due diligence in certain areas, looking at all of the synthetic tracks, and I think once the timing with the privatization of NYRA and the development of what takes place between Aqueduct and Belmont, would certainly look at all of our options. And I think it certainly has a purpose, and it could be a useful tool for the trainers. We have the luxury at Belmont to be able to fit a synthetic track inside the current configuration at Belmont, but at this point, we're just exploring what's out there.
If I may add, I know your words, Mick, a well-built, well-run dirt track is proven to be just as safe as a synthetic track. And, so I think we have to remember that too. A well-engineered and well-run dirt track is very safe. So I just wanted to add that.
Can I ask a Twitter question here for you guys? The question is whether the tracks having different dirt compositions negatively affect the dynamic loading and therefore injury risk, especially when shipping horses, as they won't have time to adapt to the new surface.
Sure. And again, that's one of the reasons why we try and keep the racing surfaces, meaning the main track at Belmont, the main track and training track, or winter track at Aqueduct, as well as Saratoga, as consistent as possible. Geographically, the sand that we use up at Saratoga is certainly different than what we have downstate. But as far as the clay amendments and even the silt that we use, that's used at all 3 locations where we import specific products for each of our tracks. And then again, horses shipping in from another location, they have the luxury of certain trainers will use only our training track and then race on the main track. And it's a little bit of the trainer's judgment on what surface suits the horse best. And again, we have the luxury of having that at 2 of our facilities.
And if I can speak to those 3 stages of the process, first is the setup and the design characterization. The second stage, though, is at the beginning of every race meet, and that's done at Keeneland and Churchill and the NYRA tracks, all the tracks that are represented up here. At the beginning, we do a series of measurements that are biomechanically based, so they talk specifically about the peak load. And what I can tell you is that given those measurements, these tracks have very different compositions to get the same outcome. The different composition is speaking specifically to the weather conditions under which they operate. You think about the time of year that you have the race meet at Saratoga versus the Keeneland race meet, the likelihood of rain. The Aqueduct race meet you would have a different base in the dirt for the winter racing, but when you actually make the measurements on them, you find very similar peak loads and similar shear strength. So what's happened is the material has adapted to the weather and used local material to give the horse as consistent a surface as possible, even though they are going to be shipping. So what we really want is we really have to adapt to the local climate and materials, but give the horse a consistent surface. And that involves a lot of measurements and a lot of testing, as Glenn points out. All right, anything else? Okay, well, I want to thank the panel particularly for their patience and openness on this. Thank you very much.